Hi everyone, I'm Jen and this is Jeremy.
Hello.
And we're here to do data-driven approaches to developing your people, workflow, and products. We'll do a quick introductions and then we're going to talk a little bit about developing people, a little talk about developing workflows, and we'll do some Q&A. I'm Jennifer. I've somehow been doing software engineering in one role or another, from engineering to leadership, for about 20 years. Right now I'm product manager at Pluralsight. I work on the Flow product, which used to be called GitPrime and was recently acquired by Pluralsight. So I'm excited to talk to you guys today about some data-driven engineering approaches.
Awesome. And I'm Jeremy. I've also been a developer for around 20 years somehow. And I've worked for everything from small little startups that couldn't keep the power on to Fortune 100 companies. And I've spent the last few years as a DevOps consultant. I'm doing a lot of DevOps stuff. So if you guys start to hear a little bit of a DevOps hint to all of this stuff, that's why I've kind of spent the last 3 years in that stuff. And in my spare time, I volunteer as a firefighter and restore old trucks, which actually has a lot of parallels to software development, believe it or not. So building a great product takes a great team. And basically the idea, like I have here, is from aha to cha-ching as quickly as possible, right? So we want to create an idea and turn that into a feature in our software as quickly as possible. And it's more important than ever right now for us to iterate quickly and do that. So we all remember, whoops. So organizations care about three things with software development teams. We care about speed, right? Being first to market because your competitors are iterating quickly and their aha to cha-ching might be faster than yours. And so features are being put out quickly, and so speed is more important now than ever. And quality is also important now. Because of that fast iteration and speed, quality is more important. So things like defects, the way we used to do it back in the old days, you'd have a defect and everybody would kind of suffer in silence and they'd be like, well, this is terrible. Maybe they'd tell their friends or whatever else. But now when we have a defect, you can tell 10,000 people in 5 seconds. And the same thing goes with like 0-day vulnerabilities. If you have a vulnerability in your software, it'll be front page news on the internet within seconds. The cost that we care about, that we're talking about here, is avoiding burnout. And that's with our people, our engineers, our managers. We really need to avoid burnout because the software development industry being the way it is, the job market is excellent. And people can just go anywhere they want to go. Everybody's looking for engineers. So we have to avoid burning them out if we can. Now we probably all remember the old way of doing software, right? The big waterfall, where we would go and get a bunch of requirements, a big pile of features, work on them for weeks and weeks, months on end, and then finally, we're going from 2.0 to 3.0 with this huge batch of changes, maybe a complete rewrite, complete everything. Now, back then, you'd be working on something and it wouldn't see the light of day for months, basically. And so one of the problems is if somebody's struggling back then, they could struggle on something for 2 weeks. You could be hung up on it and nobody would even know. It could be 2 or 3 weeks, you're sitting churning on something. And another problem with this way of development that we all know is you dumped all those features, so you got your big deploy party, right? We remember pizzas and cakes and things like that for the big 3.0 deployment. And then you'd spend the next month or so answering emails, phone calls, everything's broke, nothing works, nothing's integrating the way it should. And so that's why we got away from this. And now we're doing this agile and iterative process, right? So back to the aha to cha-ching. We get an idea, we develop that idea, we test it, we integrate it, and it's right there at the customer's doorstep within a couple days sometimes. I mean, ideally, we all hear about the Amazons and things like that where they're doing 10,000 deploys a day or whatever. So this is what we're doing now. Now this is a huge culture change for people, especially for developers. So when I started at Intel as a software engineer in 2008, I sat down and wrote code on my first day that didn't see the light of day for 6 months. Everything that I'd worked on, months and months and months for that big chunk deployment that came out. By around 2010, 2011, it was a couple of days. I was writing code and it was available on the Intel.com website to download a couple days later. That was a huge shift for me, like a complete shift in thinking, shift in the way I work. And that's something that each developer has to deal with now. So what do engineers need to be happy? They need purpose, autonomy, and mastery. So they need purpose. They have to build cool stuff, right? Nobody wants to be sitting and churning and working on bugs and defects and things like that. We want to be working on cool stuff, and we want to be productive. Like, we're the best employees ever, right? Because we want to be productive. We want to put out the more stuff to be happy. We need autonomy, of course. We need to be able to get the tools that we need. We need no bureaucracy in our way, things like that. That's what makes us happy. And then finally, mastery. Like, nobody wants to be terrible at their job in this industry. Nobody wants to be struggling and working on something and saying, you know what, I've been working for like 3 weeks on this JavaScript stuff and I have no idea what I'm doing. And, you know, engineers, they'll bounce. They don't like that. You know, we all like to be good at what we do. So the goal, I will pass it to Jennifer about how we get there.
So what does data have to do with any of this? How does it help managers and leaders provide that purpose and mastery for their engineers that their engineers are looking for? Well, it turns out that when engineers, and especially the kinds of engineers that turn into leaders, have good information, they're actually pretty innovative. They're pretty insightful and can solve most problems and handle most situations. And so this quote from Carly Fiorina really represents how we view data as its role in leadership. And the goal is, if you have data and you can turn it into information, you can turn that information into insight. And of course, you can lead without data. We've all been doing it, right? We've been doing it for years, decades maybe. You can advocate for your employees. You can coach them. You can find problems and recognize strengths without any data. But it requires you to rely on your gut feelings, and it requires you to go out and shoulder tap on your engineers who are otherwise doing great work. And so the problem is, when you do it this way, when you lead this way, you can end up with some pretty good blind spots. When you go and ask someone, some people they're afraid to share their vulnerabilities with you, or perhaps they just seem happy and they're not, and your gut feeling's just not right. And the other thing is, engineers, we're typically humble and typically really good at seeing all the problems left. Like, this is a bug, this is wrong, this is wrong. And so it's hard sometimes for them to tell you what great things they've done. It can be a little bit hard to provide the recognition that they need. And so we believe data can help with that. Data can help you find patterns and notice things that you might have otherwise missed. This could be a problem or an opportunity for recognition. If data shows you something really positive, that's great. It's also going to show you some really specific, meaningful things to recognize with your team. If data points out a potential problem, that's okay too. It's going to also help you get down into the root cause and figure out what's underlying that problem so that you're better able to craft solutions. Steve Jobs famously said, if you define the problem correctly, you almost have the solution, right? So it's sort of that, is like, hey, look, we can sense that there's a problem. So if we can dig in and find the specifics, we'll really be able to solve the problem. So to kind of show how this works, we're going to dive into this book that the Get Prime Press produced, called 20 Patterns to Watch For in Your Engineering Teams. If you don't have one, I brought a few. They'll be in the back at the end of the session. We published this book after working with hundreds of engineering teams and talking for quite a few years with different engineering leaders. And we just found that some patterns just kept coming up again and again. I find it striking how many engineers and engineering leaders read this book, and all of a sudden they'll be going through it and they'll get this big smirk. And you're just like, what's going on? And they're like, and then what it is that they recognize themselves, or they recognize their teams, at a particularly hard part or exciting part of their careers. So today we're going to just cover one of these patterns and kind of talk about how data can lead you through finding the patterns and handling the patterns. We're going to cover the case of the domain champion. So what is the domain champion? The domain champion is an expert in his area of the code or her area of the code, and they know everything about this code. Now, being an expert is really important, but sometimes there's too much of a good thing and the person ends up a single point of failure on your team. When Jeremy and I started talking about this talk, we were kind of looking through things, and we both really identified with this at former parts in our career. When I was a young engineer, I kind of just found myself in this place where I just had stuff that I owned that no one else could help me with. And I was young, and I was kind of scared, and so I didn't probably raise that up in the way that I should have. And so I worked and I struggled, and that's all right. Like I became known as like a really diligent engineer, but I can look back now at myself and realize that came at a really high personal cost, and it came at a high cost of risk to the team. I was just young and I didn't have a way to vocabularize. I didn't have a vocabulary to talk about that. And so kind of I just think back in that time and say, hey, look, I wonder what would happen if my manager had some data so that she could have helped me and notice that I was in that situation, maybe get out of it. So how can data help? And help a manager detect that this is happening. If you're a manager, and even if you don't have data, you might have some sense that this is happening. You'll notice that, hey, look, it's really hard when Jen tries to go on vacation. Or seems like she's working every weekend and nobody can really fill in her spot. Or you might notice that like this person, hey, you've got a high performer on your team and they just are never available for new projects. You really want to get them onto new projects because they'd love it and they just can't quite get there. So kind of you want to be able to notice this, and the first thing is how to notice it. So one thing that happens with the domain champion is because they're working on one spot in the code base, they tend to kind of rework things over and over again in a short period of time because they're kind of limited. And so what in Flow, we have a metric called churn. So when that's really high, it's a signal that you might have an engineer kind of stuck on one thing. And high churn isn't necessarily a problem, except you want to kind of balance with some new work, or else you're kind of, we may be in a burnout spot here. The other thing that you might see in a domain champion is that when their peers do code review, their peers may or may not provide suggestions, but they never really provide suggestions that lead to changes, follow-on changes in their code. And it's not that the domain champion necessarily is stubborn and doesn't want to take feedback. It's just that like really they're the expert in the code and people just don't have a lot of meaningful things to say there. So when you see these two things, maybe your gut feeling is supporting you, you then know, hey, I've got a domain champion. How do we handle that? So we'll talk a little bit about how to handle the domain champion. And with all of these patterns, the first step is get to the root cause. Okay, and we kind of see two typical root causes with the domain champion pattern. The first is just uneven familiarity with the code. And this is just plain old, hey, do you mind taking on some of this work? And, can you take on some different work and kind of trading around tasks? But the second root cause that we see is actually a skills gap. And this shift in workload has happened because either the team doesn't have the skills they need to work on the things that the domain champion's been working on. Maybe the domain champion has been front-running your Kafka implementation efforts, and the rest of the team hasn't kind of come up to speed in that skill set. Or sometimes the opposite, where the domain champion doesn't quite have the skills that they need for the new work, and they're sort of in their comfort zone working on this thing. So that also data can help. Pluralsight Analytics has good skills data for you to be able to kind of quickly look at your skills of your teams and say, hey, look, are we skilled up in the right places? And so that'll help you understand, look, is my root cause of this problem, just a workload problem, or is this a skills problem? So armed with that data, you can have a really, really impactful one-on-one to bring up with the data. By this point, you probably know what to do, but you're going to most likely start with the domain champion, right? In my case, what I think I wish my manager would have said is, hey, Jen, I noticed that you seem to be working on this one part of the code a lot. And I think it's great that you've been doing that and you've really stepped up, but that can really lead to burnout. And that can really lead to you carrying more than you have. Here's why I think that. Here's some data about your work. How can I help you find some reinforcements? Right? And it's a conversation that never happened for me. And that's all right, but I sure wish it would have. And here's where kind of the data can kind of come in. If your skills are all balanced, great, right? And then you can kind of have a conversation about, look, what are the next 3 things that somebody else could work on in your domain, and who could that be? But if your skills aren't balanced, right, you can have a whole different conversation. Right, if the domain champion needs some training, you can free up some time, provide some input into these courses or these videos, and Pluralsight might be great. If the team needs skilling up, you can work with the domain champion to help with that. They can provide some mentoring and some skills so that even once the team comes up to speed, the domain champion believes in their capability. So at the end of that, you'll come up with a plan, and you'll implement that plan with your team. And after that, you can all still follow up with data. You should be able to see skills numbers coming up. The domain champion should probably see some churn going down and some new work coming up. And hopefully you'll see some receptiveness coming up so that you can tell, hey, did this work, or do we need to go back to the drawing board? So that's our first pattern, and how some data can help you work through a tough situation. Jeremy's going to talk about one more.
So we've all met the person that's carrying too much weight, right? So this is basically the domain champion gone wrong. And this is somebody that's working day and night and day, taking on too much work, kind of getting stressed out, being in that perpetual state of stress. And the key thing to remember is that this person started with good intentions, right? And maybe it was they just say yes too much to too many things. Maybe they took on too many things, overconfident, like Jen mentioned. I was also that young, super confident programmer who was like, oh, I can learn that, I can do that, no problem. Yeah, 6 to 8 weeks, we got it. And so we all know where that comes from. And that starts a negative feedback loop at that point, to where the more things that they're working on, the more things they become the expert in, which is a good thing in the case of the domain champion. It's a bad thing when it goes too far. So they're the only person that knows this section of code. They're the only person that knows this and how this works. And then pretty soon, they're working nights and weekends and going crazy. And we can actually see that type of thing. So one of the other areas where that happens, if it's a skill gap. So say our team comes in and somebody comes to us and says, we have this Kafka thing that we want to try out, right? So it's experimentation and iteration again. We're going to try this and see how it works. Well, Jen's the only person on our team that knows Kafka, so she's like, hey, that's cool, I can do that. Yeah, we'll try it out. And next thing you know, a couple months later, Jen's the one working on it all day. Everybody else is like, nope, don't want to touch it, don't want to touch it. But it's kind of spiraled out of control at that point. And with something like Flow, you'll be able to see that. You'll see the differences between work that's being done, how complex it is, how often they're staying in the same kind of area of code, pointing out churn, and you'll see these in the data points. You'll also see things like whether they're working day and night, every day. Are they committing their own pull requests in the middle of the night? We'll be able to see that. You can see all of that with Flow, and you can get that data. And so that data is what you'll use to do some coaching. So the first thing you'd want to do is set up a coaching session, get some feedback from the employee. Now, self-reporting is one of those things that's somewhat unreliable when it comes to engineers, and it's usually one of two things. It's, I'm so busy, I can't take on anything, and they're actually not working on that much. That's kind of a rare case. Most of the time with us engineers, it's, I got this, I'm fine, I'm good, but they're not good. They're completely overloaded, but they're like, yeah, I got it, it's great. So if it ends up being a skills team, a skills thing, what type of skills would help productivity? How could you be better at this? Could we get you to take some Kafka courses and get better at it? Could we get other people on the team to take some courses and start to get better at it? And how can we reduce the silos? Now, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about silos probably in the last few days. And of course, the unicorn ivory tower thing is that every single person on our team will have the same skill set eventually. We're not going to have front-end people. We're not going to have back-end people. We're not going to have SQL people. Everybody's going to be front-end, back-end, SQL, DevOps, cloud native, whatever buzzword. Everybody's going to have all of it, and they're all going to be perfect. That's never going to happen. You're never going to get that. However, you can get a little bit of parity between skills if you create a plan. So with something like Pluralsight, you can actually see a lot of this stuff per person. You can see where their skills are at. So if somebody's a front-end developer, you can see it right away. This person really knows all the front-end stuff. They're great. You go to another person, well, they really know all the Spring and the Spring Boot, but the other stuff's kind of down. And you can start to level it out with this data. And you can start to create plans for people and say, how can I level out your skills a little bit? How can we reduce some of these silos? And you can do things like create a channel. So I've got a channel here called Kafka Ramp-Up. So in here we've got the basics going all the way down. And you can prioritize it with your team. You can take everybody in your team and say, okay, we've got one person who's a Kafka expert. She's going to remain an expert. That's not going to change, but the rest of you are going to need to bring things up. And so you'd prioritize it like you would with any other project. You say, I want you to do getting started with Apache right there, like the very first one. I want you to do that, and I want you guys to all have a base level so that you can jump in and start grabbing things. And if you get further and you raise it up even more, that's great. And then you go back to a coaching session. So you're iterating again, and you're saying, did this work? I told everybody on the team that they needed to be at least at a intermediate level within 2 or 3 weeks. How did that help the skills? Did they start taking things off of Jen's plate? Is she able to go hiking now? Are we getting better velocity? Are we getting better churn? So we go back to our flow, and we look at that and say, is this working? It's more of the iteration. Everything is kind of an iteration. And you could say, are you ready to take on new stuff? You guys, do you feel good about where you're at? The biggest thing is setting the benchmarks. If we go back here, is setting benchmarks with the people on the team. Say, I want you, you'll take this, you're at a novice level right now. I want you in 2 months to be at least in the beginning of the intermediate. Get them to commit to that. Get them to start skilling up and training. Ask Jen for help once in a while. And basically, you can use that data to benchmark and move things forward. And then you come back in another iteration and start coaching.
So in summary, the thing that is really important to keep understanding is that this is all a big circle. It's all a big, you're getting better and better and better and better. But you can use data to identify a pattern, either a pattern of great behavior or not so great behavior, right? And then you can create a plan that may include skills. It may include other steps that we're all aware of and well aware of in coaching. And you can build your skills and you can follow up on that plan. And then you're going to identify different patterns, and then you're going to create plans, and then you're going to build skills where needed, and over and over and over again in a cycle of continuous improvement. And the more you can use data to inform you in that, the more you're going to be in a place to have great advocacy, powerful advocacy for your team, and you're going to be in a great place for providing specific positive feedback, as well as having a good baseline for having any difficult conversations that you might need to have. And you can really just add data into your tool belt to make you a better leader and a better engineer. Oh. Well, I think that's our time is nearly up, but we do have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer some. How does data collection happen? Okay, I think we can talk about that a little bit. We have two basic sources of data. The first one is on the Pluralsight flow, which is the product that used to be GetPrime. And most of that data comes in from your Git hosts and your ticket systems. So we'll connect into those Git hosts and ticket systems and pull data in to see, and get a bunch of information there. On the skills side, Pluralsight has a bunch of skills IQ and roles IQ feedback session or tests and things that you can that your developers can take, as well as analytics around sort of what courses everyone's taking and those sorts of things.
Yeah,
Is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, there's an AI component to that also. So it's basically self-assessment. So you'll go in and say, what are my skills like in Java? Start taking it, and it will come back and say you're novice, proficient, or expert. And then it will recommend some of the soft spots, right? Because it's an adaptive test, and so as soon as you start getting a few questions wrong, it will kind of notice that and maybe change the direction. Or the same thing, if you get too many questions right, they'll be like, okay, this person's clearly good here, let's switch it up. And it becomes adaptive, and so after that, our AI system kind of churns and goes through and says, here's the courses that you could take to kind of bring up some of these other spots. And so you're able to benchmark your progress and retake the test at certain periods. So.
On skills itself?
Yeah, so there are data points with the skills for the skills side of Pluralsight, and then the data points with Flow, which is the other side, and that's the part that attaches to your repository and looks at pull requests and commits and all that.
So I think I had
Sorry. Go ahead.
I think I had some similar questions around your data collection. You had the chart with the days and all your list of engineers,
Mm-hmm.
like circles that were either more densely populated or less. Are these coming from commits to like maybe your GitLab or
They
where,
come.
where is this information coming from? What are those indicators?
The circles are commits that came out of your Git host. So GitLab, Bitbucket, GitHub, whatever. The diamonds are pull requests and pull request comments, and the squares or the purple rectangles are tickets, and those come from Jira or whatever your ticket source is. So you can get a pretty complete picture of what Dustin Chandler. This is actually our fearless leader, Dave, at Git Prime Pluralsight Flow, changed his name to protect the innocent, of what he was working on. So because first of all, he was awfully busy. You can hover over those and kind of see what he was working on to see the flavor of the work.
Okay, so the follow-up question to that is, I'm curious how this might, if you guys have any insight to how it might impact the culture. That'd be like if I was on a team and say I'm Dylan in this case, I'm not contributing a whole lot. I'm curious how that impacts maybe the morale of the team.
We've not seen when people come at it with a good heart that we see that it really strengthens things and transparency is not a bad thing. All of our engineers, if you come on our webinars, their stuff is up, and they're probably the most kind, caring, lend-a-hand engineers I've ever worked with. Our customers see good adoption and those kinds of things. We work really hard in the product to avoid things like stack ranking and other things where we see customers driving anti-patterns and nasty culture things. We really work hard in the product to pull those out of there. To be, frank, we haven't.
Yeah, not really a tool to find out who to fire. It's more like a tool to show how great everybody's doing to the executives.
Right.
That's probably
Right.
the best.
Our founder story, he built the product because he would come to like a meeting with sales, and sales would have all these fancy charts and fancy numbers, and he would come in and be like, so we refactored some tech debt and it was really cool, and it was really hard to advocate for his teams and get sort of like the budget increases he needed, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where the whole thing started, and he wasn't the only one, certainly. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so you've discussed the Zambian profile.
Yeah.
The guy who
Domain
Champion. Yeah, sorry.
And one of the things
You are still dealing with people. It does help to have some facts and to have some data to kind of show, like, this is what's going on there, and to help explain the why of why it matters, right, and those kinds of things, and the risk that, people he has, and maybe appeal to, like, look, would you mentor this other person? They could really benefit from your expertise, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I would say just being able to point to something like this, because if you do everything verbally and say, I think you're taking this stuff and you're hogging all this stuff from other people, and they're like, no, you're full of it. It's fine, it's great. You can point to something like this and say, well, actually, we have very tangible evidence here that this is happening, and we need you to help out with the other things like that. So just kind of being armed with data.
One thing we always share with engineering managers is sometimes the best way to cure things, right, is to be like, here's your new assignment. Here's the new things you need to be accountable for. So we need to make a plan for how you get this stuff off your plate. So that it's not, you're not taking away my livelihood. Like, that's not what you want to be doing, right? You want to be offering a new opportunity. Question?
This into like individual repos or projects, so someone might be the champion on one project but not on another, so you can kind of relay.
You can filter most of it certainly by repo. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Okay. I think we're out of time. Okay, we'll do this last one, and then I think we're out of time, and we can hang out though.
So you have used this method in your team and the company. What has changed since you have used this method?
What has changed in our team since we used this?
Yeah.
Well, when I joined, we were using it. So I'll just kind of share what I think is the difference between. I think, first of all, our engineers really are always willing to help each other out. And part of that is because our CTO hired well, but part of it is because it's just a really open culture. And it's also, I was in a meeting last week with our head of product, and he's like, well, what's taking so long? Aren't they almost done? And we were able to just like quickly pop in and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense what they're doing. They're refactoring those APIs. That makes sense. And it was a super great tool to have. We didn't have to like Slack everybody, call a meeting, all this. We totally got over it like in like that, like 3 minutes. So anyway, yeah. So all right. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.